Welcome, everyone, again to another episode of the Silk Stocking Sisters podcast. Today, I have a fabulous guest, Mr. Peter Thomson, who wrote about his experience of busing and integration aspects in the Boston area. So we're focusing on the North, and of course, Boston's in the North, so this is ideal for this particular podcast. So let me tell you a little bit about our guest for today. Mr. Thomson is a multi-award-winning journalist with over 30 years, give or take, covering environmental, climate issues, and audio producer. Among other things, he's also an author. The title of his book is called Sacred Sea, A Journey to Lake Baikal. And I'm going to ask him to talk about his experience with the Boston busing situation, which is called the Sidetrack Program, which I was fascinated about when I read about it, and also talk about his boat. So, Mr. Thomson, welcome.
Nice to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
So tell us a little bit about your experience, found about your article that you wrote in the Boston Globe about the Sidetrack Program, and I found it fascinating. Basically, provide some background information about where you lived and, time frame in which this took place, with the school busing situation, and how it came about.
Yeah. So my experience, when we think about Boston school integration and busing, the whole world thinks about the just horrendous explosion of violence around integration of the Boston public school system in 1974, and ongoing for several years after that. The background there was that the city had gone to great lengths to keep its system segregated for generations. And it was a classic, separate and unequal system. And there was a huge resistance to the court order. The city had defied efforts for many, many years to start desegregating its schools. And then they refused and refused and refused. And finally, there was a court order in 1974 that imposed what felt like a draconian solution. And in retrospect, it clearly was one that was extremely difficult and traumatic for the city. But it had been 20 years since Brown. And the city had not, like so many others in the country, had done nothing. So a drastic solution was probably necessary at the time. That was not my experience, although my experience was driven by that. 3 years before that, frustrated by a lack of progress, not just on integration in Boston, but integration and lack of understanding and contact and exchange between the city of Boston and the communities around Boston. My town, a small town west of Boston, cooked up this pretty radical, almost utopian idea to develop a program that brought equal numbers of students from my very white, very privileged rural town together with a group of students from largely Roxbury, which was sort of the deep inner city of Boston. It was a largely Black, although historically much more diverse. But over the last generation or so, most of Boston's Black population got concentrated into Roxbury. So the idea was to bring together roughly 25 kids each from Lincoln, all white, Roxbury, mostly Black, into a program that was this radical experiment in integration, completely 50-50 everything.
Wow.
The two groups of kids were mixed up and then split back up into two evenly integrated groups. So roughly 12 to 13 from each school. We spent half of that first year in each other's communities. My group went to Roxbury. We were housed in the Lewis School, which was in the heart of Boston, near what was then Dudley Square, which was like the heart of Black Boston.
Okay.
The other group came to Lincoln and spent half the year, half white kids, half Black kids from Roxbury in Lincoln, very white, bucolic community. Um, Within that, each of us had one Black teacher, one white teacher, one male, one female. And at half year, we switched places. So in the fall, my group was in Boston. In the spring, my group was in Lincoln. And
Now let me ask a question. So that
yeah,
means that were there some children from Lincoln who went in the spring and the other people came in the fall, or was it the same way? Was it the same configuration?
yes, yes. So each group was 50-50, 50-50 Lincoln and Roxbury. First, my group was in the fall, first in my class of 50-50.
Okay.
There was another group that was in Lincoln, 50-50. In January, we switched places.
Okay.
And as I said, I spent the fall in Roxbury at the Lewis School. The other group spent the fall in Lincoln. We switched places halfway. And the magic of it, I mean, these were folks who, we had in fundamentally different life experiences up to this point, representing sort of, in a very basic way, the fundamental sort of social, racial, economic distinctions at the time: Black, white, rich, poor, urban, suburban. Virtually no contact up to that point between the kids in the two communities. And taking us all, mixing us together, it was a response, as I said, to sort of the lack of integration in the schools throughout the Boston area. It was also, frankly, there was a new, very modest program, which many people may have heard of, but they have followed integration, desegregation efforts at all, called METCO, which was the Metropolitan Educational Cooperative. I don't remember exactly. But anyway, it took a small group of Black kids from Boston and brought them to suburban communities. So, maybe there were 10 or 15 in each school. They bussed them out to the suburbs. And it was very, sort of noblesse oblige almost. It was started by Black folks in Boston in response to a real need. The Boston schools were terrible, especially for Black kids. And there was this great social fissure between white and Black and rich and poor and urban and suburban. So they started this program to essentially bring some Black kids, very few in each community, starting in kindergarten and phasing the program in over time, over 8 years. And high school also started a little bit later. They overlapped a bit. But there was a very tiny number of Black kids that were brought to a very small select community of folks. And they were, again, a tiny minority in this otherwise very white school system. And it was sort of this old fashioned, like, it was both an important breakthrough and extremely, it did not challenge the relationships between these communities at all. It really was about the privilege of the white kids that we are sharing with the Black kids. And there was no real effort to create cultural connections. And the Black kids were still a minority in strange place, the strange place where they were very much the outsiders.
Right.
My program was called Sidetrack. The whole idea was to have kids who in equal numbers, so nobody was a minority, and in each one spending time in the other's community, so nobody was an outsider for the whole year, but we all were outsiders at some point.
Right.
So in the fall, I was in this community that I had no.
Had you ever been there before in your life?
I may have been there before. My mother was she was a good liberal, and I think the first thing I remember in that neighborhood was the first Black-owned bank was started in Dudley Square, maybe a year before that. And my mother lived in Lincoln, and she decided she wanted to support this bank. So she opened an account at this bank. And so her bank was 15 miles away in a completely new community. And she took me with her to that a couple of times. So it was not, I don't think it was my very first exposure to this community, but it was my first exposure to anybody in the community, to living in the community, to exploring the community. I had also, before I lived in Lincoln, I lived in Boston, on Beacon Hill, which was a pretty nice
Yeah.
place. My grandmother was an old patrician, blue blood Boston uh, resident. She lived on Lewisburg Square and Beacon Hill, which was a very
Yeah.
grand place. Um, that was my Boston.
Oh,
Um, and
oh,
I stayed connected to that when my parents divorced and my mom moved to the suburbs. Um, uh, so, I had a foot in the city, but I think I was also fairly unique in among the Lincoln kids in that experience. Most kids, I think, only lived in the suburbs, and Lincoln was a very rural town. It was a very old agricultural
oh,
community
was it?
almost,
Oh, man.
but it was also it was a very liberal community. It was a place that had a lot of professionals, a lot of doctors, lawyers, professors, um, and was very open to, for a suburb of its kind, it was very open to outside ideas. And it was a very sort of place that also generated a lot of ideas about its relationship to the broader world. So it was a place that was ripe for an idea like this, which was developed organically in the town. Um, but
So and did it initiate from Lincoln?
Well, it did, and it was interesting, although it was not Lincoln had this process of, they had this series of sort of town forums in which they would discuss issues of the day. Obviously 1970, 71 was a time of incredible tumult. There was the, anti-war movement. There
Yes.
was the environmental movement. There was the women's movement. There was the civil rights movement. There
Right.
was even the gay rights movement. They were all at different stages, but they were all kind of this huge churn in society. And so one of them was focused on education and schools. And after taking part in one of those, a fifth grade teacher sort of hatched the idea for this program, um, and brought it to folks in the community who might help make it happen. And they had, fair amount of discussion. They refined the idea, and then they went looking for a school in Boston that might be a partner. In Boston, even though the system was so deeply entrenched in segregation, there were some efforts within the Boston public schools to at least demonstrate a willingness to try something different. So there was this in-school special district that had 3 schools in Roxbury from elementary through high school. Actually, 2 of them were in Roxbury. One of them was in the Back Bay, which was a much wealthier community.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Um, and so each one fed into the next. In the middle of those was the junior high school, the Lewis School. And it was 6th, 7th, 8th grade. And there was a community of parents there who was also deeply involved in both that school and its and that experimental sub district, but also in in educational reform and trying to shake up the very ossified Boston society and culture, and also do the best thing for their kids in a system that was completely resistant to that. And so there was a sort of a natural convergence between this effort in Lincoln and this effort in Roxbury at the Lewis School. Um, it was a contentious, and there was a lot of, even though these folks had similar ideas, there was a lot of conversation. Some of it was very difficult. Like, how do we make this program work the best
Yeah.
for everybody? Because the needs and desires of the families and the kids from both communities were extremely different. But there was a meeting of the minds, and there was, even though the idea was developed in Lincoln, there was fertile ground in this community at the Lewis School in Boston.
Okay. Okay.
So fairly quickly, they had a meeting of the minds. They developed this program. It was it was brought together very quickly, created very quickly. They got a grant from the federal government, um,
Right.
and that was under something which I had no idea until I started researching this project. It was under the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which
Okay.
was essentially part of the Great Society plan, and
Program.
sort of the third leg of the of Lyndon Johnson's uh, civil rights project. There was the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and then the Education Secondary School Act, which was essentially the way of enticing school systems around the country to get on board with integration. This was something I
Considerable.
had
Yeah.
no idea.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because there was no real mechanism to enforce Brown. And this was this was not enforcement, but it was a big carrot because the feds had no real role in local schools until that point. They finally said, we're going to throw a lot of money at you, but you have to integrate in order to get that money. And there was also a small pot of money for experimental projects, and that funded our project.
Oh, that's what was your part. Oh,
Yeah, yeah.
so
This was not something I hadn't had the time to go into in my story for the
that's
quote.
okay. Yeah.
But it was fascinating to me, sort of the genesis of it all, and that role of this sort of unknown, underappreciated part of that 1960s Great Society civil rights revolution.
So this was the
Um,
outgrowth of that experiment from the 1960s that expanded into the
it, it,
1970s when you at Boston.
yeah,
Yes.
yeah. In a way, it was. I mean, as I said, the idea came independently, and then they went looking for money, and the money came through this other program, this big federal program, which
Right.
allowed stuff like this to happen.
Right.
Um,
Right. That
so
was fantastic. Okay. Well,
yeah,
but so we, as we know, I mean, just share the fact that I read it that it only lasted 1 year. Even though you had a
yeah,
3-year grant, it only lasted 1 year. And much of
yeah,
it talked about in the article about how the parents in your town decided it wasn't something they wanted all their children to continue to do because there was rip raff kind of things happening there. Like, okay, this was cute, maybe the first year, but that's okay. We want to send our kids to make sure they get education, and we don't want to be part of an experiment. And I think that sometimes is the thought process that goes through for parents who are part of an experiment, so to speak. Um, and I'm just saying not necessarily because I know that occurred in a situation with the black male students at what I was part of, the black male students. That's really what happened to them. They just they did not make it through the program. They did not stay.
yeah, yeah,
Okay. So I was
yeah.
wondering if that was part of the same thought process, some of the parents from, from Lincoln.
Well, it's interesting. Yes, I mean the program was hotly debated in Lincoln before it was adopted, and there was a lot of pushback. And Lincoln had this reputation for being a very open-minded and liberal community, and a lot of very illiberal and closed-minded stuff emerged from the community as it was debated. But it ultimately was adopted, um, and the original goal was to get like 96 kids from each community, which was ridiculous because the Lincoln school system was very small to begin with, but
Oh,
also because the appetite for it was frankly quite
limited.
small, even in that town. So 25 kids signed up. The second year, there had been some significant challenges in that first year. Not surprising at all, given both the nature of the experiment and the fact that there isn't any new experiment. There's a shakeout process. Things are going to not work. Some things are going to go completely wrong. And there's going to be a reevaluation after that first year. So there were real problems that had emerged that then made many of the Lincoln parents even more uh, reluctant. At the end of the first year, I remember they took the question to town meeting: should sidetrack continue? I went to that town meeting. I spoke in favor of sidetrack. It was a very contentious meeting. It was ultimately adopted, and I think it had to be adopted by a 2/3 vote. So it was not a narrow decision. Um, However, only 16 families signed their kids up. They needed 25 to continue with the federal grant. Roxbury got its 25 students. There was no question about
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
My mother and my best friend's parents were among the parents who took us out of the program.
Mm.
Um, and they were both big supporters of the idea. And I think that they recognized how important it had been for us. But I think they also felt like academically we had fallen behind.
Okay.
And they,
Okay.
but what I think the bigger lesson there is that Lincoln had much lower stakes invested in the program. For Lincoln kids and
Oh,
families,
definitely.
it was something that was good to do. It was important in a big social sense, but it was not something that was seen as crucial to their educational and social development
Yeah.
by many parents. And the things that we were supposedly losing, were more seen as more important. Among the Roxbury kids, it was and their families, it was seen as much, much more vital to their social and educational development.
Okay.
And, um, and so the Lincoln families, the cost of not doing it was a whole lot lower. For the Roxbury families, this was they were interested in
Like a
the
break. It's like a
integration.
break. Like a breakthrough for those parents.
Yeah, yeah, they were interested in the integration, but mostly they were interested in getting their kids out of the awful experience of the Boston public schools.
Okay.
Um, and those both of those things were important, but fundamentally, this was a way out of that dead end system.
I hear
That
you.
not only a dead end system, but a system that was like beating kids down every day. Um, and so the stakes for them were so much higher than they were for my family. The fact of the matter is, in Lincoln, like if I'd stayed in sidetrack, if all the other kids who had signed, who didn't sign up, signed up, and we got our 25 students, we all would have been fine. We all, however, much less we might have gotten of algebra or of this or that or the other thing, we all would have been fine because we had lots and lots of other things going for us.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
but our parents weren't able to sort of see beyond that to
Understandable. Yeah. Yeah.
and the fact is, like, it's not like we were doing a favor to the Roxbury kids and saying like it's good for them to be around us. This was a transformational experience for me and for so many of the other white kids in the program. And
Well,
I
that's
think
why I
that
wanted to talk. That's why I want to talk about because you talked about in the article about how it impacted you. So, how do you think this experience impacted you now in your life beyond that experiment? That's key because that's something that
yeah,
I want to hear
yeah.
people's input. Even that 1 year, even having just a 1 year, do you really believe it impacted how you thought, what you did, what you didn't do? Did it make a difference in your life overall?
I think it made an incredible difference in my life. And I should note that there was another element to this, which I think was equally important. In addition to the sort of 50-50 everything, we also spent 3 half days a week, at least, in some cases 4, out of school in the community, doing community-based electives and exploring the world around us and getting to know what Roxbury was like, what Boston was like, what Lincoln and the suburbs were like, and going deep into. I had a course called Law in the Courts. We went to every part of the legal and judicial system, from police stations to prisons, and
Wow.
met with people at every point in that spectrum. Um, and a program on government, a program on journalism and communications. I became a journalist partly because of what I experienced here, learning about. We went to the Boston Globe, where I ended up 50 years later writing this article. We went to WGBH, where I ended up 40 years later working. Um, and and then others were just going, like, there was a place in Boston called Project Place. It was a community center, halfway house, public, community service center. We went there and we hung out with homeless people and kids in the neighborhood. And this was a part of, like,
During this time of the
yes,
oh,
yes,
really?
yeah. Um, and um, so we got this incredible exposure to
Uh,
other
mm,
folks. As one of my classmates from Roxbury put it, was like we got to meet people in the wild, not in a zoo.
right?
Them and us. This guy went on to become a Boston cop. Um,
Oh, wow.
he said it was the most important educational experience of his life.
Yes.
Um, he also, frankly, he didn't become like, a radical activist. He's a pretty conservative guy, but it was incredibly important in his life and learning about the world beyond his block, his school.
Right.
Um, and so that was something that combined sort of the integration, the radical integration with this exposure and exploration to the larger world. Um,
Okay.
for me, it, I think so. Just getting to know folks who were not like me. Um, as I said, my grandmother was from a rich old Boston family. She had a house on Cape Cod. The only Black people I knew before that were these 2 women, Tilly and Dora, who cooked for her. They were wonderful women, but it was very much, they weren't like, we didn't think of them as servants, but they basically were.
Uh-huh.
We thought of ourselves as nice liberals, but this was a classic old school relationship. I never got to know them outside of, like, they cooked
What they
lovely
did,
meals
they
for
had a
us.
role
Yeah,
there, and that was the role
yeah,
they served, and that's how
yeah,
you saw them.
yeah, yeah. This was, a radical shock and awe transformation from that. I was in the middle of this place where, like, I was an outsider. I was I was excited, but I was also, like, afraid. And as many people that I spoke with, I went back and I found many of the kids who participated in this, and they all had many of them had a similar theme, that that experience of being an outsider. White kids, the experience of being an outsider was transformative experience for them. It wasn't just that they learned about racism and prejudice and what life was like among, the other half. As one friend of mine said, it was like, it was the first time in his life he understood that not everybody was getting the same deal that we were in Lincoln. Um,
Interesting.
but it was also just being an outsider and being in a place where, like, we felt like we were menaced by just the color of our skin. We were not all that welcome in Roxbury. Boston was a place that was hostile to Black kids just about everywhere outside of Roxbury. And Roxbury, I write about it in my story in the Globe. Roxbury, in turn, was not all that friendly to white kids.
That's right.
And there was a lot of suspicion. There was a lot of resentment. What the hell are we doing there? And
Right.
some of us were attacked. I was one of them who was attacked. One of those kids who was attacked left the program.
Okay.
Another one who was attacked even worse. She almost had her hair set on fire. She had beautiful long blonde hair. She was in this community where, like, that was a total outlier. She was chased by these other girls and they tried to light her hair on fire, and she stayed. I didn't think for a minute about leaving. This was my community, and everybody came to her rescue, and all the kids in the class came to her rescue. And
But you have to
I
think about that the frame of reference. If you when you described how it was in Boston, which is Roxbury was the single pretty much community where all Black people lived, quote unquote.
back
And
then, yeah,
and so that means they were insular there and they were felt safe
right,
there. And to
yeah,
have guys come in, it was like you're like, oh no, they're invading us. We can't have any
yeah,
place we can feel
yeah,
safe. All right.
yeah,
So that's the mindset project that's going on. Whereas any place outside of that, they're outsiders and they don't belong.
right, right.
Okay.
And that, I think, was one of the most profound elements of this program. It was not like the Black kids come to Lincoln and we hang out, maybe go to school together and then they go home at the end of the day. Like, we go there. And it was, it was similar. It was different, but similar coming to Lincoln for the Black kids from Roxbury.
Right.
Um, they were also subject to a fair amount of harassment by non-sidetrack white kids who, one of my friends said basically, like, wanted to tell us, like, you don't belong here. Um, but it was also, that was something that they were much more used to. This was
Yeah, that's
something that
right. Yeah,
we Lincoln
exactly.
kids were not at all used to.
Right,
Um,
right.
um, so that, that was profound, but also the fact that, like, our, within our own little community, our class, like, everybody pulled together. And, you know, when, when there were tensions, I mean, it was hard, to be sure. The kids were very different, and there was a lot of sort of testing those boundaries of racial and cultural differences, and teasing and poking and prodding. Um, it never descended into anything, uh, really challenging fundamentally within that community,
Okay.
in that class. But
Yeah.
it was certainly challenging. It was absolutely getting to know each other. And, you know, even over the course of the full year, like, I can't say I became fast friends with any of the Roxbury kids. I wasn't very good at making friends anyway,
Okay.
but, it was still true that at the end of the day, we all went home. And at the end of the year, we all went home. Um, and so, most of the friendships, I was thinking about this, like, for a long time, I wondered if Sidetrack ultimately did succeed in
Yes. That's
in
the
its
question.
goals of breaking down these barriers and starting to create relationships. And when I remember that year, I remember how profound it was to be in that group. But at the end of the year, I completely lost track of everybody from Roxbury. And that was true as far as I knew among all of us. And so I wondered, like, for a long time, was this, did it succeed in that fundamental
It depends
goal?
upon how you define success. And I think
Right.
that's something that I dealt with in terms when I was writing my book about how do you see success, because it's like if you not, but part of the issue is that if you don't live around people, oftentimes that dictates the relationship,
Absolutely.
right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so that's part of it. So let me ask the question because we have a couple of more minutes left. I wanted to ask you about your thoughts about the resegregation of schools and
Mm.
how do you think that this would be something that would work now? And if so, why? If not, why not?
Yeah. So that was my big question. I went into this research project and I had to, I knew it had been a profound experience for me, even though I hadn't stayed in touch with any of the Roxbury kids after that one year. Um, and a few other, 3 or 4 other Lincoln kids that I had stayed in touch with and I'm still friends with today. I knew it had been a profound experience for us, but I did not know beyond that whether it had been for anybody else from the rest of the Lincoln kids or the Roxbury kids. And until I knew that, until I explored that, I couldn't say whether I felt like it had been successful, or whether, I began this project in the spring of 2020, the middle
Okay.
of the explosion around George Floyd murder and Black Lives Matter demonstrations. And it was a time of like intense despair in some senses about race relations and how little things had improved in the 50 years since Sidetrack. Um, and I felt like what my question was like, was there something in this program that could work today that could help us start again to chip away at this historic problem that we just haven't been able to solve. But until I could find people and find what their stories were, I didn't know the answer to that question.
That's a good point.
And then I started finding people, and with a, a, a lot of specific differences, people essentially told the same story. This was a
Oh,
profound experience in
yes.
their life that changed the way they understood the world and their society, and the need for people to understand each other and relate to each other in a very different way than we had. Um, and what I took away from that was that this could still have value today. Something like it. You wouldn't be able to reproduce it exactly, but there's something like it, this fundamental 50-50 of where nobody is an outsider, nobody is a majority. Everybody shares an experience in which they are in their own community and in others' communities, and also like getting out and really exploring the world in a
Right.
very real
Right.
way.
Right.
That's something that basic model is tremendously powerful. And I think that it could help and succeed today. I think it would still be very challenging to make it happen, but I think that there is magic in that model. And I think that was proved to me by my going back and exploring this program
And
50 years
speaking to
later.
other people. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's what
yeah, yeah,
that's how you learn. That's what the research says. Like, okay,
yeah.
what do you think about it? How did you feel? What did you go through? I think that, and I also say that you're interesting. You studied this in junior high school. Do you think it would have been even more of an impact, and you would have been more in communication with people had this occurred in elementary school?
Probably. Um, I don't remember why they decided to. And in fact, nothing in the record that I explored said why they decided it should be junior high school, 7th and 8th grade, as opposed to starting earlier. Except I think that they felt like um, students at that age would be more ready to step outside their comfort zone, and parents would be more ready to let them do that.
Right.
Um, ultimately, something like this, if it were given time and resources, could develop in a lot of different ways. And one might be to start it earlier. Um, uh, Certainly, the longer you have relationships with people and the longer you have an experience, the more comfortable you become with it and the more time you have to forge those relationships.
Exactly.
So,
Exactly. Well, I really appreciate you sharing this information. I'm glad you had that experience. Because I think it really sounds like it was really bode well for you in your life. And it sounds like also the other people who you connected with 50 years later, they also felt the same similar kind of experience. So
yeah,
that anything that just says, if any research, it's like that says the success of that program, even though it only lasted 1 year. But it also says what we can think about moving forward, what we might be able to do now in a way that could be um, open to having people to have a better connection at an earlier age. So thank you for sharing that. Any final words of thoughts for the future?
um, well, I know things have changed in the last 50 years, and although sometimes it can be hard to, uh, to feel that, um, I've been encouraged by the response to this story. This is one small story that, um, you know, had was basically sort of disappearing from memory until I did this. And as people have learned about it, I think that some people have been inspired by it. I don't think that it's like a grand solution to anything, but I think what we need is not so much grand solutions as small. I mean, obviously we need policy. We need structures and policies that support this kind of stuff and push things in a certain direction. But ultimately it comes down to things that people are going to buy into, in, whatever the context is. And I think that this is something that I've gotten a lot of response that this resonates with people. Um, and, there's even some talk in Lincoln where I grew up, where the program began, of trying to restart something like this. And that's very hard. I don't know if it'll happen, but I'm just glad that people are having the conversation. And, it's made me think a lot more about, my life now and how I can, continue this legacy today. And, but I think there's nothing, the, the, the idea around which I built this story, and it was originally going to be the beginning of the story that I wrote in the Globe, was a quote from Thurgood Marshall in a 1974 desegregation case that actually slammed the door on mandatory interdistrict, intercommunity segregation, desegregation. It was specifically about Detroit, but it also affected Boston and lots of other cities.
Right.
In his dissent in that case, Thurgood Marshall, he was the guy who argued the Brown case in the Supreme Court and won, and then was appointed in the Supreme Court by Lyndon Johnson. He said, if our children cannot learn together, we will never learn to live together. Mm-hmm. And I think that is the fundamental challenge here that this program tried to challenge, and I think proved if our children do learn together, they will learn to live together. And I think Sidetrack proved that. And I think that's an idea that still has tremendous power and is tremendously necessary today. So I guess that's the last thing. And then I'll just put in, the story itself. If our listeners and viewers want to read it, it's in the Boston Globe. It's called "The Radical Forgotten Experiment in Educational Integration That Changed My Life." It was published in January of 2023.
Definitely just fabulous. I love the fact that you have pictures, you have the teachers, it's fantastic. Definitely people check it out. It's an excellent, well written, of course, but also it includes photographs and identifying people. I think it's fabulous. So definitely check that article out. And I thank everyone for listening, and I'm thankful to our guest today, Peter Thomson, and all he's doing. And I will definitely stay in touch with him for sure.
Yeah. And with me, and with you, Teresa.
Next time, everybody. Thanks again, Mr. Thomson.
Thanks so much, Teresa. Take care.